Hey, welcome back everybody. It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to wrap up our Archetype breakdown for core set 2021. We've got two color pairs left, white-red and blue-green, which we'll be talking about today. If you haven't checked out the other videos in this series, go ahead and do so before you check these out. Not that the order really matters, but as always, we are going to look at an individual color pair, talk about the key uncommon and what it says about the color pair, talk about the rares that fit into that color pair better than some of the others, and then of course break down our payoffs and enabler cards. So we're going to go ahead and jump right on in with our aggressive archetype for the format, white-red. This is just going to be a bit of an aggro deck. This is what I like to call a loose archetype, where there isn't an overarching theme, right? It was pretty obvious with most of them. When you look at blue-white, it's pretty obvious that you're drafting flyers. When you look at something like red-green, it's pretty obvious that you need to be drafting 4-power creatures, right? And for a new player who's done no research, they can open up packs and see that theme just scattered throughout the cards that they're reading while they're drafting for the first time. White-red is a little bit different, because there's not really an overarching theme to it, or at least there's not a single thing you can put your finger on when you're looking at the cards in the set and say, oh, that's the white-red deck, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. So white-red is going to fit into the territory it usually fits in, which is just going to be an aggro deck or a go-wide deck where you're looking to push through a lot of damage with early cheap creatures, or go wide and use some sort of mass pump spell to get your creatures through for extra damage. The gold uncommon here is actually very good, but requires you to draft a couple pretty bad cards. So let's talk about it. Alpine Houndmaster is red-white for a 2/2. It is an uncommon, and we'll read the second part first. It says, whenever Alpine Houndmaster attacks, it gets +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of other attacking creatures. So this attacks as a 2/2, but with other creatures, it attacks as a minimum 3/2 and can get even bigger than that, right? If you're attacking with this and 3 other creatures, this thing is going to be a 5/2, which is a pretty big deal, and of course incentivizes you to have more creatures on board that you can attack with. And while that's a pretty good aggressive card, the real power in this card lies in the first ability, which says when Alpine Houndmaster enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a card named Alpine Watchdog and or a card named Igneous Cur. Reveal them, put them in your hand, shuffle your library. So let's go ahead and look at those two cards real quick, because they're just random commons in the set, which aren't super exciting on their own, but become a lot better when you have this Houndmaster. Igneous Cur is 1 in a red for a 1/2. It is a common elemental dog, and for 1 in a red, you can give it +2/+0 until end of turn. This is a functional reprint of cards that we've seen in the past. For example, Ember Eye Wolf comes to mind from Shadows over Innistrad. Not a particularly good card, a card that people tend to like a lot more than they should, because this is the type of card that trades off for other 2-drops, but makes you invest extra mana into making sure it can do it. Although sometimes these cards can get carried away if unblocked and so on and so forth, but not a great card. Same goes for Alpine Watchdog, 1 in a white for a 2/2 with Vigilance. That's it. Nothing exciting. A fine 2-drop with very, very minor upside, but not a card that you're super excited about. Neither of these are premium commons for a red-white aggro deck, but red-white decks do want 2-drops. The upside, of course, is that if you have an Alpine Houndmaster in your deck, every time you play that Houndmaster, you get to go fetch one of these up. So having this in your deck when a Houndmaster enters play is basically free card advantage. Of course, there are times where you're going to draw the dogs before you draw the Houndmaster, and that really decreases the power level of basically all the cards. But the fact that the Houndmaster can potentially come down and draw you both of these cards from your deck means that if I have a Houndmaster in my draft pile, I am definitely looking to draft at least 2 copies of each of these dogs and be as aggressive as possible. It works the other way too, where if you get one of these dogs late or you see them wheeling around, it might be worth picking them up and just hoping you get an Alpine Houndmaster in a later pack. But yes, Houndmaster I do think is a very aggressive card. It's very unique for Boros as a card advantage card on top of just being a good attacker. And even without the dogs, it does have that second ability. Probably not going to matter too much since it will never gain toughness. It's just going to trade off with another 2-drop, but it can hit pretty hard. And yeah, if you pick up an Alpine Houndmaster early, I would look to probably pick up about 2 copies, because keep in mind, the Houndmaster can grab both of these. It's not just one or the other. When it enters play, you can grab both of them, which is a huge, huge swing for an aggressive Boros deck. Next up, we'll talk about some of the rares that fit here. Obviously, Glorious Anthem is a powerful card for almost all white control, or not control decks, almost all white decks except for control decks. Control decks aren't interested in a board pump effect like this, but aggro decks certainly are. And the same way a card like Karavek, the black legend in this set that gives all creatures -1/-1, is just like super powerful and underrated effect when you just read it on paper. Glorious Anthem is just as powerful. Not a flashy rare, nothing super exciting, not even a rare that I'm sure I want to first pick too often. But if aggro tends to be pretty good in this set, which it has been in previous core sets, then yeah, Glorious Anthem is a card that maybe we will be first picking. Obviously, if you get past this while you're a red-white aggro deck, you're extremely happy and you'll bias towards white just to make sure that you get your Glorious Anthem on board. We have Idol of Endurance, which is an interesting take on card advantage for white. I think this is more geared towards Commander, but it definitely has a place in Constructed, and I expect it to be pretty good in Limited as well. It is 2 and a white for a rare artifact. It enters the battlefield. When it enters the battlefield, you exile all creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard until the idol leaves the battlefield. So if the idol gets destroyed, all of those creatures that are exiled underneath it will go back to the graveyard. For 1 and a white, you can tap it, and until end of turn, you may cast a creature card or a creature spell from among those cards exiled with Idol of Endurance without paying its mana cost. So it's a little expensive to get rolling, but the idea is you trade off a bunch of 2-drops and 3-drops, and you stockpile your graveyard with small creatures in your aggro deck. Maybe even you can play this outside of an aggro deck, some sort of attrition deck, right, where you're sacrificing creatures. But the Idol of Endurance will come down, exile all of those creatures that died throughout the game out of your graveyard, and then for 1 and a white each turn, you can essentially cast one of those for free. And note that this is part of the resolution of the effect. I'm pretty sure you can do this at instant speed. The way it's worded, I think you can pay 1 and a white. I'm not 100% sure on whether you can cast these creatures at instant speed or not, because it does say until end of turn. Basically, once you activate it, you have free reign to cast one of those creatures for the rest of your turn, but you can activate it on your opponent's turn, and I'm not sure if this gives you the ability to, like, let's say, flash a creature out unless it already has flash. So let's leave that one alone and just evaluate it as though you're using this once per turn on your own turn. Well, how many creatures do you need to get under Idol of Endurance for this to be really good? Probably only maybe 3 before it becomes excellent, and you do need to make sure that you're not under too much pressure, but you are the aggro deck, which means that your opponent is often going to be playing defense, which means they're incentivized to trade off, get your creatures off board, and then Idol of Endurance is a slow way to continue to get creatures back onto the board. So I like this card a lot. Again, I'm not convinced that this is a first pick card yet, or at least I don't think I'll be first picking this card and just pushing myself into aggro because of it, but there are a lot of decks that probably aren't interested in this sort of effect, so I could see it getting passed pretty late in a pack if you are the aggro deck and you're just sniping all the early game creatures out of the packs. It's a pretty powerful effect, especially for white. White does not get a lot of recursion or repeated recursion, especially for its aggro deck. So I would keep an eye on this one. I feel like it's going to play out pretty well, but I'm not 100% sure about it. And someone can let me know in the comments below the rules interaction with the last ability, whether or not it lets you put creatures into play on your opponent's turn if you activate the ability. Next up is Subira Tolzidi Caravaner. It's a mouthful. 2 and a red for a legendary human shaman. Is a rare, and it's a 2/3 haste. So already 3 mana, 2/3 haste. Probably a card that you're happy to play in your aggro deck. Not super excited, but happy. For 1 generic mana, another target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. It does say another, so it can't target itself, but this lets your other small creatures get in unblocked. And it's pretty cheap, right? A single mana to make a creature unblockable is nice, even if that creature is not going to be dealing that much damage. But it's cheap enough that you could presumably activate this multiple times on different creatures and just make an army of small unblockable creatures for the turn. Subira also says, for 1 and a red, tap it, discard your hand until end of turn. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So you kind of see what they're going for here, right? Get a bunch of small creatures on board, activate Subira, discard your hand. Hopefully you've emptied your hand out, right? You're just casting a bunch of small creatures, getting them on board, emptying your hand as much as possible, and then you use Subira's abilities to make those creatures unblockable. You activate the second ability so that each time they connect, you'll draw a card, and you basically use this as a way to turn all of your small creatures and extra mana into extra card advantage. You won't be activated in every single turn unless you can empty your hand, but it does give you extra tools to play around with. Subira is more of a build around type card, right? There are decks that don't want this sort of effect, or at least they'll play a 3 mana 2/3 haste with upside nearly every single time, but it's not super exciting. In fact, Subira is not really designed to even make herself unblockable or trigger off of her own ability. She really just functions with other creatures. So you can see the route you need to go down if you have Subira. But if you're in a red-white aggro deck, this is a nice way to get extra cards out of your creatures once you have essentially emptied your hand, which you will be doing in a low curve aggro deck. And it's a nice way to just make sure your creatures can get in there. I think Subira is quite strong, and I do think this slots right into red-white aggro. I'm not sure if there are even too many other red decks that care about these sorts of combinations of abilities, but you'll play it in basically any red deck, and you'll be super excited to have it here in a red-white aggro deck. Pack Leader is up next. It's 1 and a white for a 2/2. It is a rare dog. It gives your other dogs +1/+1, and whenever Pack Leader attacks, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn to dogs you control, including itself. So it makes your dogs not unblockable, but unkillable in combat as long as they're attacking, for the most part. Now, I do want to mention here that, yes, there's this whole dog and cat thing kind of dispersed throughout this core set, but there is not really a dog deck. Red-white is not dogs.deck or anything like that. In fact, I'm pretty sure Pack Leader might be the only card that positively cares about dogs in the entire set. Note that the Cat Dog Legendary, the Naya Legendary, is a buy a box promo, so it's not actually in this set at all. And note that there's actually even a cat in green that gives all cats protection from dogs, which is just huge. But don't take Pack Leader and then think that you're going to be drafting a dog deck. What you should do is take Pack Leader, and then if you have a close pick between a dog and another card that are of equal power level, go ahead and take the dog. Obviously, Pack Leader is really nice with the gold uncommon, the Alpine Houndmaster, because you're already being incentivized to pick up those other common dogs. So Pack Leader is fine. It's less of a build around and more of just a fine aggressive card that's hard to kill in combat when it's attacking, and it might buff some of your other creatures here and there. But again, this is not quite as powerful as it looks, just because dogs, while there are some here and there, are not super well supported, or at least it's not a full theme. It's more of a sub theme in this archetype that you'll sometimes have and sometimes won't. So moving right along, we want to go ahead and talk about the payoffs and enablers for the red-white aggro deck. By enabler, what I'm really looking for here are creatures or sorceries or effects that can put multiple bodies on board for a single card, which there are not that many in this set compared to previous core sets. There's not a lot of token generation in these colors, or at least it doesn't seem like they went out of their way to make every other card make tokens. So we're pretty limited on what we have as far as making multiple bodies goes. And then the payoffs are going to be cards that can turn a board of creatures into an actual threat, either make them unblockable, things like Subira, or pump your entire board, things of that nature, right? So as far as enablers go, let's look at some of the creatures or effects that can put multiple bodies on board. We've talked about Falconer Adept before in the Blue-White Flyers video. It's just as good here. It's 3 and a white for a 2/3 uncommon human soldier, and when it attacks, you create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying that's tapped and attacking. Now, obviously, this card needs a little bit of help, right? A 2/3 for 4 is not the easiest creature to swing into an opponent's board and have come out the other end, but you do get a bird every time you get to do that, and if you can protect this card, make it evasive with, I don't know, something like Subira, then Falconer Adept is just going to carry your whole entire game on its back. those birds do get out of control. If you're not able to deal with the adept and it's swinging at you every single turn, the birds are going to add up and multiply over the course of the game, and you're probably just going to die to this card single-handedly. So it's a must-kill card, very powerful must-kill card, but does, in fact, take a little bit of work to get going to get those multiple bodies out of it. Goblin Wizardry, I believe we've mentioned at one point, maybe in the red-black deck. I did not realize until recently that this card is an instant, which does make it a slight bit better than I gave it credit for when I talked about it in the red-black deck, but here it is nonetheless. We care less about prowess this time. Again, for those who don't know, this is 3 in a red, instant at common. You make 2/1/1 red Goblin Wizard tokens with prowess. So 4 mana instant make 2/1/1s is a little bit below the bar, but they do have prowess, which means if you get to untap, you can threaten to pump those creatures with other effects, and if your go wide effect is an instant or sorcery, or rather a non-creature spell in general, then you're going to get an extra little bonus off the fact that these things have prowess. It's not the highest priority due to how expensive it is for red-white, but I do see this card being a little bit better, although I do think there are multiple archetypes possibly vying for this. I could see red-blue spells really wanting this card, and red-black sacrifice wanting it as well. So it might end up being an earlier pick than I think, but again, 2 bodies for the price of 1, even if they start off a little bit weak. They do have the potential to deal quite a bit of damage. Valorous Steed, 4 and a white for a 3/3 common unicorn with vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. We've seen this sort of I guess pairing, right? The 3/3 unicorn with the 2/2 knight. We've seen this a couple times now, and it generally plays out fine. This one is quite good because everything just comes up front. You're getting your 5 power and your 5 toughness right away. The vigilance is on the bigger body, which is quite nice. You get 2 cards for the price of 1, and while neither of those cards are individually that good, they do represent 2 creatures which can deal damage and can attack. So Valorous Steed seems like a fine bread and butter type common for this deck, even though you probably don't want too many because it is a little bit on the expensive side. We're doing due diligence here. If it makes 2 bodies, we're mentioning it. So Valorous Steed, probably one of the better ones for your red-white deck. Chrome Replicator is a very interesting one. It's 5 colorless mana for an artifact creature. It's a 4/4 uncommon construct. When it enters the battlefield, if you control 2 or more non-land, non-token permanents with the same name as one another, create a 4/4 colorless construct artifact creature token. So essentially, if you have 2 cards with the same name on board, they can't be tokens, they can't be lands, then you make an additional 4/4 on top of this 5 mana 4/4. 5 mana 4/4 is already, just as a baseline, a close to playable card. It's not quite there, you want a little bit more out of it, but the delta between when this card doesn't make the 4/4 and when it does is just gigantic. And of course we're mentioning it here because it can make 2 bodies for the price of 1. But I also wanted to mention that this works kind of in tandem with the uncommon red-white creature that we talked about, because with the red-white creature, the Alpine Houndmaster, you're already incentivized to try and pick up multiples of the dogs just to make that card work. That Chrome Replicator all of a sudden gets even better if you have those multiple dogs as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the dogs. If you have a Chrome Replicator in your pool and you're red-white, you plan on playing this card, then yeah, I would look to find multiples of certain creatures, but Chrome Replicator seems like the upside is definitely worth drafting around a little bit, and obviously, again, mentioning it here because if you get 2 4/4s out of this, this is probably the best top-end card you're going to get for red-white, but it does take a little bit of work, and the baseline is not necessarily the worst in the world either as a 5 mana 4/4. Warded Battlements. So we're moving on to cards that reward you for having large boards of creatures rather than things that make multiple bodies. Warded Battlements is perhaps one of the worst ways to do so. It's like the world's worst glorious anthem. 2 and a white for a 0/3 common wall with Defender, and attacking creatures you control get +1/+0. Now, I think this was designed with the fly-in archetype in mind as a way to block small creatures on board while pumping your attacking flyers. Generally, walls tend to play well in the flyer deck, but, this is a card that could occasionally make your red-white aggro deck. It's very weird, right? It's a creature that can't attack in a deck that cares about attacking. Very disparate abilities on the same card, but if you are really struggling for a way to turn your board into extra damage, and you have all the ways to just build out a huge board or just looking for some mass pump, you could do worse than warded battlements, but you could certainly do better. And speaking of doing better, the next card up is Bolt Hound, which is 2 and a red for a 2/2 haste. It's an uncommon elemental dog, and when it attacks other creatures you control, get +1/+0 until end of turn. So it has a very similar effect to warded battlements. It has to engage in combat itself, and it is just a 2/2, so it will die often, but this is more what I want. A creature that's attacking and cares about pumping my other attacking creatures, rather than something that can never attack and does the same. Warded battlements, of course, just gives a sweeping effect to your attacking creatures, but Bolt Hound pumps some of their attacking as well. It's very similar effect. They're basically the same effect with different wording, but Bolt Hound is the card that you would bias towards. In fact, I think Bolt Hound is just good. If your opponent ever doesn't expect it, you might be able to sneak it in there and get a bunch of extra damage in out of nowhere, and that's quite a bit on a 3-mana creature. Burn Bright is up next. This card was horrifically unplayable in, I want to say, Ravnica Allegiance. Correct me if I'm wrong. It might have been the other Ravnica set, but Burn Bright is 2 and a red for a common instant. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. It does work on defense. If you're using a card like this on defense, you're probably in trouble. It means you're really desperately trying to block and get something off board. You want to use this on offense, and it's very easy to see situations where this card is great. Oh, I'm going to attack with 5 creatures. They're all going to get +2/+0, and my opponent's going to die. Doesn't play out that well. The problem with these cards is that they often get stuck in your hand, and they're not particularly good on defense because they don't pump your toughness at all. So unless your strategy is going to work out every single time and you're going to follow up with a Burn Bright and kill your opponent, I would avoid using this as your go wide pump effect. Basri's Solidarity we've spoken about in the green-white counters video, but here it is just as good of a payoff. It's 1 and a white for uncommon sorcery, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Just everything gets a counter for 2 mana. That's pretty huge, and in fact, that is probably as good as a Burn Bright is ever going to get. For cheaper mana, it is sorcery speed, but you get a permanent +1/+1 buff in those counters. And you are red-white, you are overlapping a little with the white-green deck, so there might be some synergies there with the +1/+1 counters as well. This is a card that you're super happy to have in an aggro deck, and it does reward you for having multiple bodies on board. Basri's Acolyte we've spoken about as well. One of the better commons in the set. It's 2 white for a 2/3 lifelinker at common, and when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures you control. So a nice way to use multiple bodies, make them more relevant, pump them up, while also adding a reasonable lifelinker on board. Not much to say about this card. It's obviously very powerful if you can get the 2 counters off of it. And as I said before, even if you only ever get 1 counter off of this, it's still great. Just make sure you're getting something a little extra out of it, that you're not just playing it on a naked board, and it will do just fine. Siege Striker is 2 and a white for a 1/1 uncommon human soldier with double strike, 3 mana 1/1. Okay. When it attacks, you may tap any number of untapped creatures you control to give Siege Striker +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature tapped this way. So really, you only need to tap 1 creature with Siege Striker before it becomes a 2/2 double striker, which for 3 mana is acceptable. Not great, but acceptable. Not only do double strikers pick up these mass board pumps that we're talking about very well, but Siege Striker can turn a board of small creatures into one super sizable attacker, which is sometimes how you get through a board that your opponent is now stabilized on, right? Your opponent might be able to deal with a bunch of small creatures by just making it so you can't attack without losing too many creatures, but those boards might not be able to deal with 1 giant double striker. So Siege Striker is interesting. I think it's quite good. It does ask you to kind of dump a bunch of resources into one spot, which can be a little bit risky, but I think Siege Striker is worth it. I think you'll be happy to have this in your red-white aggro decks. Destructive Tamperin is the last card we'll mention here, and I didn't want to mention it because it really fits into the categories, but if there's a deck that really wants this, it's one of the red aggro decks, perhaps the green-red big creatures deck, or the red-white go wide deck, and it's basically just a falter effect. 2 and a red for a common sorcery. Choose 1, destroy target artifact, or creatures without flying can't block this turn. Sometimes that last ability, making your opponent's non-flying creatures unable to block, is just how you intend to win a game, and sometimes that's your whole game plan, right? if you are just not built, if your deck is not built to make it into the late game and win through a stabilized board against a control deck or something like that, you might need a card like Destructive Tampering to win the game for you. Obviously, this gets even worse against flyer decks, and you don't care about the destroy target artifact card, but effects like this do pull their weight every now and then if you're playing them in an aggro deck, usually as a one-of. You might remember this card actually being very good in Kaladesh, but that was because the destroy target artifact really mattered there. Here, it doesn't matter as much, so you're playing this as a 3-mana falter, and a lot of decks won't be interested in that, but you will see people lose to this card, and I did think it was worth a mention here. Alright, and rounding out our archetype review, we will finish off with the Simic deck, the blue-green draw 2 deck of the format. The draw 2 thing has kind of been thrown around in different color pairs for the last couple sets, and it's usually a pretty fun archetype. Blue-based draw plus some payoffs from the other color. In this case, it's Simic, which is a unique territory for Simic as far as a full-blown limited archetype goes. Obviously, the theme here, make sure that you're drawing extra cards each turn, and, well, your cards will trigger off of that. The key uncommon here is just a generically good card that obviously gets better when you're drawing extra cards. That is Lore Scale Quaddle. It's back, 1 in a green and a blue, 1 green blue. For a 2/2 uncommon snake, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Lore Scale Quaddle. This usually plays out extremely well, right? You play it on turn 3, you draw on turn 4, and you already have a 3/3. So 3 mana 3/3 on offense, and it gets bigger than that. The more cards you can draw in a turn, the bigger this card gets. It's a threat that can get really, really out of hand very quickly, and as early as turn 3, right? Drops off a little bit later in the game, but it does pick up its speed as the game progresses. The longer this thing sits on board, the more of a threat it becomes. And it's just a fine card, right? Very splashable as well in other archetypes that are going to be drawing cards or care about large creatures, things of that nature. I expect Lore Quaddle to be just as good here as it has been before, and it has been pretty good in the past. Ghostly Pilferer is the first rare that I'll mention for this archetype. I didn't mention every single card. I should make a little disclaimer here. I did not pull out literally every single blue-green card that says draw a card on it, because there's a lot of that, but I picked out kind of the best of the bunch when it comes to the rares and the commons and the payoffs, right? One of those, of course, is Ghostly Pilferer, which is 1 in a blue for a 2/1. It's a rare spirit rogue. When it becomes untapped, you can pay 2 mana, and if you do, draw a card. And that's going to be on your turn most of the time when it becomes untapped, so it's pretty good timing, right? Obviously, the idea is you attack with this, and then on your next turn, it untaps, you pay some mana to draw an extra card, which is kind of nice. Obviously, it's 2 mana 2/1, so getting it in there is going to be a little difficult, but it has that covered as well. It says, discard a card, can't be blocked this turn. So the idea is you discard excess cards you don't need, the Pilferer gets in unblocked, deals a little bit of damage, and then the next turn you can make up for discarding a card by having it untap, pay 2 mana, and draw that card back, right? It also has a little bit of a weird ability, which is less geared towards limited and more geared towards constructed and commander. It says whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. I feel like that was kind of like designed with Companion in mind before Companion got nerfed, where that no longer triggers this. But that's not something you should have to worry about too much in Limited. People are not casting creatures for free that often. Maybe with something like the Eidolon of Endurance or things along that line. But there's not a lot of ways to cheat creatures in the play while also casting them. So I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that ability. The basic idea here is that this is a potentially aggressive 2-drop blue creature that can draw you extra cards, although a lot of times it will net even. You will almost always have to discard a card to make sure this creature connects and survives, but you get paid off by getting that card back, and then that extra draw can help trigger cards like Lore Scale Quaddle and some of the other cards we'll see in this video. There's also Jolrael, am I pronouncing that right? I don't know. Moanvuli Recluse, 1 in a green for a 1/2 rare legendary human druid. 2 mana 1/2, not very good. It does say, however, whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 2/2 green cat creature token. And note that it is only going to trigger once per turn. You can only draw your second card once each turn, right? It's not every 2 cards you draw. It's just once. When you've hit your second card, make a cat. And that's pretty good. If you play this on turn 2, you untap and play any sort of draw spell. Anything that can draw an extra card, you're going to get a 2/2 cat just automatically, and this can get out of hand and make multiple cats. It's got a little bit of a weird ability. It says 4 green until end of turn. Creatures you control have base power and toughness XX, where X is the number of cards in your hand. A little bit strange, right? This is really weird. Obviously, the more cards in your hand, the more potent that ability is. But I guess the idea is you only need like 3 or 4 cards in your hand and then activate this ability, and suddenly all of your creatures, including Joriel and all the cats that she's made, will get pumped and just have, a lot more power than they did otherwise. It's a strange ability. Obviously, it's incentivizing you to hold on to cards, which you can decide whether that's right or not. But I think most of the power of this card is in being able to generate extra tokens off extra card draw, even if it's only once per turn. That is still quite strong. And having that activated ability is not negligible. I don't mean to undersell the potential of that card making all of your creatures into 4/4s, 5/5s, 6/6s. I just find it a little bit strange of an ability, even though I do think it's a good thing to have on the card. Sublime Epiphany. This is a card that probably didn't need to exist, but it's here. It's 4 blue for a rare instant. Choose one or more. Counter target spell, counter target activated or triggered ability. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. Target player draws a card. Alright, so this card is very powerful. It is very good and limited because you can usually get a good little 3-for-1 or 4-for-1 off of this. Not very often that you're going to be countering a spell and an activated or triggered ability at the same time, but I read this as 6 mana counter spell, copy one of your creatures, bounce something, and draw a card. And for all of that, we're mentioning it here because it draws an extra card while doing a bunch of other powerful things. So yeah, you're going to play this in your blue deck. Even if you're not countering a spell with this, this does enough on its own with just 3 of the modes. Just the last 3 modes, copy one of your creatures, bounce something your opponent controls, draw a card, is very powerful. And if this happens to trigger something like Joriel or a War Scale Quaddle or any of your other stuff, you're just getting extra bonus out of an already powerful card. Teferi's Ageless Insight is 2 blue for a rare legendary enchantment. If you would draw a card except the first one you draw in each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. So with the exception of your draw step, you're going to be drawing double cards from anything that has you draw cards. That means like an Opt, for example, will draw you 2 cards instead of 1. This is a powerful effect that just isn't really worth it in limited. If you've got that much card draw in your deck already to make Teferi's Ageless Insight good, you're probably doing fine. You don't need to make it double card draw. I wanted to mention it here because, yeah, it can turn a single draw into a draw 2, which might be relevant, right? Imagine you have a card like Joriel and an Opt in your hand. Teferi's Ageless Insight will make it so that you can draw 2 on your opponent's turn, but that is a lot of pieces coming together, and I expect Teferi's Ageless Insight to be a dud more often than not, so I wanted to include it more as a way to say don't draft this card. It is not good, but we're going to do our due diligence here and just mention things that work in the archetype. I'm not a believer in Teferi's Ageless Insight. I don't think you need double card draw in a deck that has a bunch of extra card draw, and if you don't have a lot of card draw, then this card's just not really doing anything anyway, so leave it on the sidelines. Teferi, Master of Time. I'll try to breeze through this because it can get a little complicated. It's 2 blue for a mythic 3 loyalty Teferi that says you may activate loyalty abilities of Teferi, Master of Time on any player's turn anytime you could cast an instant. So just to clarify, that means you can use one of his abilities on your turn, and then on each opponent's turn you can activate one of his abilities as well. So you can +1 him on your turn, pass the turn, and then +1 him at any point you can cast an instant during your opponent's turn, which means you get kind of double activations out of your Planeswalker as time goes on. The +1, pretty simple, draw a card, discard a card, and that's why we mention it here on this list, is because it is a pretty reliable way to just draw extra cards. Even if you're not netting card advantage here, you do get to loot a lot, and you get to make sure you're triggering your draw 2 effects and things of that nature basically every single turn. -3 says target creature you don't control phases out. And without getting into all of the complication of phasing, just read what's in parentheses. If you phase something out, just act like it doesn't exist. If you have a question about it, the answer is it doesn't exist. And that's as much as we're going to say about phasing. I'm a little disappointed it's back in a core set, but there you go, phases out. -10, take 2 extra turns, blah, blah, blah. No one cares. The fact is, Teferi's a pretty good card filtering machine as a game goes on. The -3 is not a great protection ability because phased out creatures will phase back in on their controller's next turn, but it is a temporary solution to a big problem. And the real power here, the real reason we're mentioning it is because you can +1 every single turn, including your turn and your opponent's turn, and really trigger your blue-green draw 2 spell. So Teferi, fine card, not a super busted Planeswalker for limited, but a good card that is going to be quite good in blue-green. Elder Gargaroth is another card that has the word draw a card on it, and it's green, but I'm not even going to read this card is because it is just an insanely busted mythic rare. I think I've mentioned it once before in the green-red video where I also didn't read the card because it doesn't matter. It's one of those cards that just has a million points of text on it, and one of them just happens to be draw a card, so I wanted to mention it here. But yeah, if you open an Elder Gargaroth, it doesn't matter what archetype you're in, just take the card and play it because it's going to win you the game if it's not answered. So that's all I'll say about that one. Draft Elder Gargaroth, it's pretty good. And that leaves us with Maze Mind Tome, which is 2 colorless mana for a rare artifact. You can tap it to put a page counter on it to scry 1. You can pay 2 mana and tap it and put a page counter on it to draw a card. But it says when there are 4 or more page counters on Maze Mind Tome, exile it, and if you do, you gain 4 life. So there's a little bit of tension here. Obviously, the ideal situation is that you get to draw 4 cards off of this. There's kind of a 4 card minimum or 4 activation minimum to this card, which is really unique. You have to balance whether it's right to scry or use your mana to draw extra cards. And again, the ideal is that you want to draw extra cards, especially in blue-green. That's why we're talking about it, right? You want to find ways to draw extra cards. The thing is, you don't always have 2 free mana open, and it doesn't cost anything to scry, but when you do scry, you put a page counter on it, and you're essentially denying yourself one of the extra draws. So it might be better to just not use it at all and wait until you have extra mana to draw a card if you're able to do that. It's kind of a long-term game plan to draw extra cards, but it is a way to draw extra cards up to 4 potential times, which means for your initial 2 mana investment and a bunch of extra mana over time, you're going to replace this with a bunch of extra cards and gain 4 life back, which is nice. Of course, the card itself is a little bit of a puzzle in itself as to how you need to use it, but blue-green will pick this card up, and I think they'll be happy to play it. In fact, I think this is a card you're playing in basically any archetype. You're just super excited about the extra card draw if you happen to be in blue-green. Moving into our last chunk of cards here, the payoffs and enablers for blue-green. Again, we did not sit here and pull out literally every single card that says draw a card. We picked the best of the bunch, or the ones that I think you want to prioritize when it comes to drafting this archetype in Core 2021. The first is Tome Anima. This is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 common spirit, and it can't be blocked as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn. Fine, little common, right? 4 mana 3/3, just a little bit below the bar. 4 mana 3/3 unblockable, quite good. So if you can reliably make sure you're drawing extra cards each turn, this is going to be a threat your opponent has to deal with. Don't want too many of them, but I could see this being kind of your win con for the deck, at least at the common level. Gnarled Sage, 3 green for a 4/4 common Treefolk Druid with reach. So 5 mana 4/4 reach, perfectly respectable card, and it's got a minor upside. It's not as huge as like the Tome Anima. As long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, it gets +0/+2 and Vigilance. Vigilance means that you can attack with it, whereas otherwise you might not have attacked with it, so that it could sit back and block a flyer or block, just be on blocking duty in general. It's nice. I wouldn't go out of my way for this. I wouldn't draft too many multiples of this card like I would the Tome Anima if I found myself in this color pair, but it's fine. You'll probably play the first copy, and sometimes it'll play both offense and defense if you're consistently drawing extra cards. Tolarian Kraken, 4 blue for a 4/6 uncommon Kraken. 6 mana 4/6, not too good, but the ability is actually quite strong. It says whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1 mana, and when you do, you may tap or untap target creature. Now, one thing to note here is that this is always going to trigger on your turn with your first card draw during your draw step anyway, and you have the option to take a permanent out of block duty for the turn, which is already quite strong, but this plays exceptionally well with instant speed card draw. Obviously, I mentioned it here because, yeah, this is an archetype that cares about drawing extra cards. Tolarian Kraken is a payoff that cares about drawing extra cards. But if you happen to be in any blue deck with instant speed card draw, Tolarian Kraken is going to be very powerful. I'm thinking like looter type abilities, which obviously are going to be pretty good in this archetype, right? Tolarian Kraken can take defense out of the question for your opponent on your turn, but more importantly, with instant speed card draw, you can just lock down attackers, which kind of pulls double duty. If you tap a creature on your opponent's turn, it's going to be tapped on your turn anyway, and then you can focus on just attacking rather than paying mana to tap those creatures. I think Tolarian Kraken is going to be good. Again, 6 mana 4/6 is not the most exciting thing in the world, but when it's a 6 mana 4/6 that can also take attacking and blocking out of the question for your opponent, that card deserves a second look. Teferi's Tutelage is 2 and a blue for an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, then discard a card, and whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2 card. We've seen this card before. We, in fact, saw it as Psychic Corrosion in Core Set 2019, and that was a potential win con. A single Psychic Corrosion could win you the game if you were able to build a control deck, especially one that was able to draw extra cards. Teferi's Tutelage is basically the exact same card, but it spots you a loot and a single trigger as soon as it enters the battlefield. So it's a strictly better Psychic Corrosion, which I think is supported in this deck. If you can play defensively, and you can make it so your opponent can't kill you, Teferi's Tutelage will win the game. It's just a matter of whether or not you are going to die before it does that, because if Teferi's Tutelage doesn't seal the deal, if you don't actually mill your opponent out, it's horrendous. It didn't really do anything if you die. It doesn't matter how many triggers you got, if you die before your opponent mills out, the loot is not going to be enough to pay 3 mana, right? So if you have Teferi's Tutelage in your deck, it is your entire game plan. You're playing cards like Gnarled Sage, Tolarian Kraken, but you're less excited about the anima and unblockable creatures and things like that. You can also board it in against control decks where it's an absolute house, but I expect Teferi's Tutelage to end games. I expect it to be a card that people will play quite often, and you'll roll your eyes at it the same way we did with Psychic Corrosion, but it is worth mentioning here that in an archetype that cares about drawing extra cards, Teferi's Tutelage does go up quite a bit. Burlfist Oak is up next. 2 green for a 2/3 uncommon tree folk. Whenever you draw a card, Burlfist Oak gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So it's like the reverse Teferi's Tutelage. With Teferi's Tutelage, you want to play as defensively as possible. You want to draw a bunch of extra cards, but you're not looking to attack at all. Burlfist Oak is the exact opposite. You're looking to smash with this card. Baseline, this is going to be a 4/5 on your turn because you'll draw and it'll trigger for just your first draw. But if you can draw any extra cards, let's just say 1 extra card, this thing attacks as a 6/7, and with a divination type effect, anything that can draw 2 cards, this is going to be an 8 power attacker on your turn, which can get out of hand quite easily. And there are cards that can draw even more than 2 cards, so be on the lookout for those cards. Burlfist Oak doesn't play defense well, but it is a huge beater, and you will see these on the table. Just watch out. They can get very big if left unblocked. Frantic Inventory is one of the draw spells I wanted to mention here. It's 1 and a blue for a common instant. You draw a card, and then you draw cards equal to the number of cards named Frantic Inventory in your graveyard. Note that when you cast one of these, it will not count itself due to the way spells resolve and stuff like that. So the first Frantic Inventory just cantrips into another card, which is already good enough for this deck. You hope for a little bit more. You're probably not playing a single Frantic Inventory in your deck, but that is already good enough if it's triggering some of your other abilities. The second Frantic Inventory is quite good, as it'll be a cheap divination that triggers cards like Burlfist Oak twice or Lore Skill Quaddles twice. And then past that, once you get the third, fourth Frantic Inventory, you're really getting away with murder on your cheap card draw, and you're just going to outcard advantage your opponent, let alone beat them down with whatever you're triggering off that card draw. I like Frantic Inventory a lot because it's an instant, so once you've cast the first one, any additional copies can trigger your stuff even on your opponent's turns. Cards like Joriel, things that care about drawing multiple cards per turn, can trigger on your opponent's turn. So be on the lookout for Frantic Inventory. If you see them late in a pack, it's probably a good idea to move in or at least pick them up speculatively. Try to get 3 or 4 of them in your deck, and they will be a powerhouse draw spell. Library Larcenist is 2 and a blue for a 1/2 common merfolk rogue, and when it attacks, draw a card. So this being a common is quite powerful. Obviously, it's really frail as a 1-2 that doesn't attack super well. It's often going to die in combat, but if you find a way to get this in, maybe you can grant it fly-in, make it unblockable, things of that nature. Library Larcenist can attack turn after turn, draw extra cards. It reminds me a lot of the, Auspicious Thief, I believe it's called, from Core Set 2020, the 2 and a black 2/2 attack, lose a life, draw a card. I think this card's a little bit worse because a 2/2 doesn't rumble quite as well as a 1/2. But if you can find ways to get this card in, it's going to pay you off a lot, which is a lot at common. Warden of the Woods. My pick for best uncommon in the set currently is 4 green for an uncommon 5/7 Vigilant Treefolk at uncommon. I believe I already said that. When it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw 2 cards. So this is a house. First off, 6 mana 5/7 Vigilance is a real body. That's a real threat. That attacks just fine. 7 toughness means it doesn't die very easily, and it blocks. You're not ever attacking into a 5/7 without some sort of trick or some sort of backup, right? It just doesn't happen. 5/7s are huge. 6 mana is reasonable for that as well, for a creature that plays offense and defense just as well. And then this ability is super annoying. It's one of the most tilting abilities I've seen on just random uncommon creature. If your opponent wants to interact with the Warden of the Woods, you are going to draw 2 cards, which, yeah, sure, is an upside for this Simic deck, but that's just a powerful ability in general. And note its ability or spell. So yeah, if they target this with a kill spell, you're going to be up a card. In the exchange, you're going to draw your 2 cards back, and you'll be happy with that. Actually, you'll be up 2 cards, clearly. But if your opponent has only a way to deal with this that's something like tapping it with an ability, they're in a lot of trouble because you can draw 2 cards every time they target it. So Warden of the Woods, just generically powerful. Every green deck will play it. Again, I expect this to be one of the top tier uncommons, if not the best uncommon in the set. And sure, Simic is certainly a home for this card, but it has a home in basically every green deck. Track Down is 1 and a green for a common sorcery. It says scry 3, then reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature or land card, draw a card. So it's a nice little way to get an extra card draw. It gives you a lot of selection for just a green random common, right? Scry 3 and then potentially draw a card is quite nice. Gives you a nice way to filter cards you don't need out of the way while also putting another card in your hand, so it almost always cantrips. And they did word it such that you do draw a card and trigger your abilities. So it's a nice little common. I don't think you want too many of these, but it was worth mentioning as a green potential cantrip type card, you know, your preordained type cards. Cetacean Train is back. It's 1 and a green for a common aura. It enchants a creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. That's why we're mentioning it. And it gives your creature +1/+0 and trample. So it's a minor little benefit. This card played out quite nicely in Theros Beyond Death. Granted, some of that was by virtue of this just being an enchantment, even if you didn't care about the effect too much. But it replaces itself, it draws a card, it triggers your abilities, and it gives you a minor little buff, which on some of the bigger creatures, things like Warscale Quaddle or the 4/4 Reach, that can sometimes gain vigilance. That's a pretty good effect to have. So Cetacean Training seems like it's going to be just fine here. Maybe a little bit worse because the enchantment subtype doesn't matter here, but still probably just as good if all you care about is cantripping and getting some sort of minor effect. And that's going to go ahead and do it. Thanks for sticking around. I think this one went a little bit long, but we had a lot of cards to talk about. That's it for Core Set 2021. If you have any questions or I missed anything, or maybe there's like a whole nother archetype worth talking about that's not just a 2-color pair, like a Sanctum deck or something like that, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Obviously, you can subscribe below if you like this sort of content. You can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. And I appreciate you just hanging out. If you're still at this part of the video, thanks for watching, and I hope you do well in any sort of pre-release events you might play, or if you're just playing on Arena, hope you have fun. Thanks for watching. As always, my name's Timothy with ManaRocks. I'll see you all next time.